A suspect is currently in custody after shots were fired at the White House Correspondents Dinner last night. At the time of recording, the motive remains unknown, but DC police have confirmed the suspect was heavily armed with a shotgun, a handgun, and knives. Rather bizarrely, Donald Trump very quickly commandeered the White House briefing room to process a national trauma through the only cognitive framework he possesses, his own bottomless narcissism.
That was very unexpected. A very beautiful thing to see a man charge a security checkpoint armed with multiple weapons. And he was taken down by some very brave members of Secret Service, and they acted very quickly. One officer was shot, but saved by the fact that he was wearing obviously a very good bulletproof vest. I just spoke to the officer. They were supposed to, and you see the attacker in different positions, but you also see the attacker totally subdued and under control. So as you know, this is not the first time in the past couple of years that our republic has been attacked by a would-be assassin who sought to kill.
During the Q&A, he offered a response to a New York Post reporter that is, in a profoundly grotesque way, unusually accurate, even if the entire functioning world vehemently rejects his underlying premise. Let us watch.
Thank you, President Trump. There's a report in the New York Post that this assailant assembled his weapon somewhere on site at the hotel. What do you think about that? And I ask respectfully, why do you think this keeps happening to you?
Well, you know, I've studied assassinations, and I must tell you, the most impactful people, the people that do the most, you take a look at the people, Abraham Lincoln, I mean, you go through the people that have gone through this, where they got them, but the people that do the most, the people that make the biggest impact, they're the ones that they go after. They don't go after the ones that don't do much because they like it that way. And when you look at the people that have either, whether it was an attempt or a successful attempt, they're very impactful people. Just take a look at the names there, the big names. And I hate to say I'm honored by that, but I've done a lot. We've done a lot. We've taken this country, and we were a laughingstock for years, and now we're the hottest country anywhere in the world. We've changed this country, and there are a lot of people that are not happy about that. So I think that's the answer, Peter.
Let us first dispense with the customary absurdities. He claims he has studied assassinations. It is a staggering overstatement to suggest this man has ever studied a single subject in his adult life, much less the historical intricacies of political violence. But consider the operative word in that rambling, incoherent display of megalomania: impactful. He operates under the profound delusion that he is targeted as a consequence of his monumental achievements. And the great, agonizing tragedy for the rest of us is that, in a strictly literal sense, he is entirely correct. He has been deeply impactful. But it is not the impact of a statesman. It is the impact of a vandal. It was a maneuver sold to the public on the transparently fraudulent premise that corporate windfalls would magically translate into higher wages. Instead, we have the cold, unforgiving math. The top 1% of earners walked away with an average tax cut of over $50,000. The poorest 20% saw roughly $60. Now, those meager tax crumbs thrown at the working class have officially expired, effectively raising taxes on everyday families, while his corporate benefactors had their handouts codified into permanent law. He deliberately blew a multi-trillion-dollar hole in the national deficit solely to engineer a staggering upward transfer of wealth. Then, functioning under the delusion that he possesses a sophisticated grasp of global trade, he imposed indiscriminate punitive tariffs. He was, and remains, intellectually incapable of grasping the elementary macroeconomic reality that a tariff is simply a regressive tax paid directly by the American consumer. The measurable impact was a squeezed middle class, agricultural markets that required massive federal bailouts, and skyrocketing costs at the checkout counter. Then there is the crowning masterpiece of his destructive legacy, the Iran War. We are now bearing the agonizing cost of an entirely avoidable vanity project born out of his fragile, deeply insecure ego. Out of pure, spiteful vindictiveness toward his predecessor, he unilaterally abandoned the Iran nuclear deal, lighting the fuse for an absolute financial black hole. Every single day, this conflict burns through $1 to $2 billion in unbudgeted taxpayer money. He is firing off Patriot missiles into a Middle Eastern meat grinder, vaporizing over $12 billion in the initial weeks alone, just to soothe his own narcissism. But the true casualty of this war is the American household. Because he required the aesthetic of a strong man on television, global oil prices have violently surged past $110 a barrel. That is not an abstract market fluctuation. That is a direct, punitive tax on the working class. American families have already been bled for nearly $100 in direct gas and diesel costs by April 1st alone. And if his unhinged, reactionary escalation continues, those same families will be suffocating under an extra $550 in direct fuel costs by September. And the economic devastation does not stop at the gas pump. By turning the Middle East into a war zone, he hasn't merely spiked the cost of crude, he has physically suffocated the most vital maritime shipping corridors on the planet. Commercial freighters are now being forced to reroute thousands of miles just to avoid the conflict. When you compound those paralyzed, fractured supply lines with the exorbitant cost of diesel required to actually move the cargo, the inevitable result is supercharged inflation. It is ruthlessly driving up the cost of groceries, clothing, and everyday freight across the board. While he sits safely in his country club, the ensuing market volatility is quietly vaporizing billions of dollars in equity from the 401ks and retirement portfolios of working Americans. He has forced the American taxpayer to underwrite an economic disaster projected to exceed $1 trillion, obliterating household budgets just to finance his desperate need for attention. And as this crisis metastasizes, the United States stands remarkably alone. That is because he spent his tenure systematically eviscerating 70 years of post-war diplomatic architecture. He treated the NATO alliance like a mafia protection racket. He alienated our closest allies, routinely insulting the leaders of the United Kingdom, Canada and Germany, while simultaneously drafting literal love letters to bloodthirsty autocrats. He did not merely abandon the geopolitical alliances that won the Cold War, he set them on fire. Finally, look at his impact on the very citizens he swore an oath to protect. For years, he led a relentless, obsessive crusade to eradicate the Affordable Care Act. He offered no replacement. The cruelty was the entirety of the point. His administration maliciously gutted the individual mandate, slashed funding for enrollment, and expanded short-term junk insurance plans that offer no real medical coverage. He actively pursued legal avenues in the federal courts to strip healthcare protections away from millions of Americans with pre-existing conditions, leaving vulnerable families one arbitrary medical emergency away from absolute financial ruin.